Okay, let's talk about this in JavaScript. There's a lot of confusion when it comes to this. When we see it in a function, we tend to think that it has a connection with that function, and it does not. Okay, you'll see this in a function, but it has no association with that function. What it means is it's like a generic placeholder for an object. That's really what it is. If you've done any C# generics, okay, the type T, okay, that just represents whatever object type that the function's going to use at that time. Or actually in C# it would be a method. The functions, when a function is a property on an object, it's called a method. So in JavaScript, we use this because we don't know what object this function is going to be operating on at the time. And that's really all it is. But the confusion comes with identifying what object it's working on. And the way to do that is by looking at how the function was invoked. Because that's when this is actually bound. It's when the execution context is created. That's when this is created. So let's take a look at some code. At the top we have a sayName function. So it has a console.log and it prints out this.name. So what we have here is just a function that's going to work on a generic object. Okay, so in this case we can't pass in the object. We're looking at sayName, not sayName2. So with sayName, what does this mean? This means we're going to have to use call or apply to use this function. Or we could take our object and create a property that points to this function. We could do that too. But let's run this code and see what happens here. So we use node. Okay, so it's the top one above the dashes. So we call sayname.call with A and sayname.call with B. If you look on line 13, that's where we actually created our literal objects with the name of Tim, and B has the name of Jim. So when we use the call function on the sayname function, we can pass in the object that we want this to represent. In the first case it's A, second case it's B, so it prints Tim and Jim. Well, let's look at our on line 5, sayname2. This is another way of doing this. Instead of using this, we can not even use this. We'll just pass in our object. It results in the same thing. And that's in between past the dashes and this area right here. And once again, we call it by just sayname2, pass in A, sayname2, pass in B. We get Tim and Jim. Same thing. But you'll probably see it used a lot with object-oriented programming. If you remember in the prototype properties talk, we talked about how prototypes are used to share code, and that's where this comes in. We're talking about generics, so we don't know what object it's going to be running with, okay? And that's a good case for sharing the code. So if we look on line 9, we'll see the talk function. And then we add a sayname function to talk's prototype, okay? And then down here on line 16, or I'm sorry, 15, we create a talk object called X, and then we define a name property on X called Johnny. So as you can see in the bash window, when we run x.sayname, the this object is X. Okay, and so we get Johnny. There's really nothing special about this. I think the whole point of confusion comes from thinking that this has something to do with the function that it's in, and it's really not. It's just how the function was called. You can pass this in. This can be the object that called the function as a property. You can just not use this. So I hope that clears up the confusion on this, and it really is that simple. Just play around with it. All right, guys.